Welcome back, y'all, to another lesson of the Motivate Me application. And in this one, we're going to be talking a little bit about communicating with the API and what that means and what it looks like. So what we see here is the API documentation for the Motivate Me API, which is an API that we created. It's just the most basic public API available. It's got one endpoint. An endpoint is just a URL that you communicate with, and it returns you a random quote. So you're going to have to get used to reading API documentation. Some of it's pretty complicated, some of it's pretty descriptive, and some of it's not. You'll find good API documentation. You'll find not so great API documentation. In this particular case, this is the most basic API documentation available. It's just one single endpoint. So basically what we're looking at here is, obviously we see the title up here. And to the right here, we see that this is V1 of the API. I don't want to get all confusing about all of the intricacies of APIs right now, but basically you could have multiple versions of an API, and that's because applications will use, let's say, V1, and then later down the road, the API developers, they might need to change something, and that change might break applications that are using the API. So what they do is they version it and they create a version 2. And so when you communicate with the API, will say which version you're trying to communicate with. In this particular case, there's only one version of this API. It's the most basic API ever, and it's not going to be changing. So this isn't something that we're going to worry about, but that's basically what that means. So then beyond that, we've got the actual URL for the API right here, which is motivateme.kojo.io/API, which is pretty basic. So it looks like a website URL, but we're actually going to communicate with that URL in a different way. Instead of it returning us a website, it's going to return us what's called like a JSON response. JSON is just another language. It's a way of displaying data, and it's basically based on JavaScript, and we're going to have to decode that in the application. We're going to see what that looks like. But like I said, instead of returning a website, it's going to be returning JSON data. So then below that, we're going to have a list of routes. In this particular case, we only have one route, and that route is /quotes/random, and it's a GET request. So there's many different types of requests. There's GETs, there's posts, there's puts, there's patches, there's deletes. But in this particular case, we're only going to use the GET request. A GET request is just a standard, hey, look, I'm looking to get some data request. So that's what we're going to be doing here. So basically what this is telling us is we're going to have to call the endpoint through motivateme.kojo.io/API/quotes/random. And if we click on that, we're going to see that underneath this request, there's only one variant of it, which is just the standard get retrieve a random quote request. So then if we click on that, we're going to see a little bit more data about it. We're going to see a little mini description here, along with some request parameters. In this case, we don't need to give it any parameters. In future applications that we build in this course, we are going to be having to pass in some parameters to do different types of requests. But again, we're just trying to play with the basics of APIs right now, just so we can get to understand them. So the idea here is to keep things as bare bones and simple as possible. So in this case, we don't need any parameters in the URI. Again, more on this in another lesson. So then this is the important part. This is something that we're going to have to mess with a little bit. So this is some response documentation for this particular endpoint. So the nice thing that we've done in this documentation is provide a Swift example of what this is going to look like. We're going to use this, and I'm going to show you what this means and how to use it here in a second. But this is telling you how to use this request in Swift. So that's cool. The other thing that is important here is the response example. So this is showing us what the model of the response is going to look like. So we can see here that we're going to get this JSON object, and that JSON object is going to have this data object, and the data object has a lot of properties. The data object has an ID, text, author image URL, and background image URL. And we're going to need these 4 properties right here to display this properly. Because if we remember from the design, you'll see here that we've got the text, we've got the author image URL, we've got the author name, and then we've got the background image URL. So we're going to need all of these things so that we can display this to the user. So that's basically what API documentation helps you do, is see what those properties are going to look like and how we can interact with them. So what we're going to need to do here is we're going to need to fall back on that model view controller architecture so that we can build this application. So we can see here that we have this model, and the model is a quote right here, and the quote is constructed like this. So we need to create this model in Swift. So if we go over to our Xcode project, we're going to start by doing that. So let's go ahead and create another folder here, and let's call it models. And inside the models directory, we're going to want to create two models. We're going to want to create the model for a quote. And a quote is going to basically look like this. This is going to be what a quote is constructed like. But we need one more layer above that, which is what the quote response looks like. And the quote response, that's how we're going to parse out this whole entire thing. So let's create one more file here. And again, I'll show you what this looks like if you're not following. But yeah, we're going to create this quote response file. So let's start there. Let's start by creating, actually, I take that back. Let's start with the quote model. So what we're going to want to do is create a struct, and we're going to call it quote. And this is going to extend that codable protocol. You'll remember using this whenever we were dealing with local storage. And basically, again, just as a refresher, what the codable protocol allows us to do is we can easily convert this data type from other formats like JSON or like a plist file, for example. We can convert those types into Swift and use it there. So we're going to be decoding and coding data from those other types. And whenever we are extending the codable protocol, basically what we need to do is make sure that we're only using properties of primitive data types or of other codable types. So in this particular case, this is really easy because all we need is we need that property of text, which is of type string, which is one of those primitive data types. And then we're going to want, we don't need a comma there. And then we want the author, which is also going to be of type string. And all of this is coming from that, all of this is coming from this documentation right here. So we've got the text, which is of type string, the author, which is of type string, the author image URL, which is of type string, and the background image URL, which is of type string. And we need to make sure that all of these property names match exactly. So let's go back over here. So we've got text, which is of type string, author of type string, author image URL of type string, and background image URL of type string. And to just clean things up, let's just indent these real nice so they're easy to look at. Okay, now that we have the quote model set up, we need to set up the model for the quote response. So to do that, let's go ahead and take a look at our documentation again. And all that this is we're going to get a data object, and that data object will be a quote. So that makes it really easy because all the quote response model needs to look like is struct quote response, which is of type codable, and it has one property which is called data, and that's of the type quote. So now we have two models that exactly represent the data that we're going to get back from the API. Again, we're going to have this data object, which is right here. That data object will be of type quote. And if we go into that quote model, we're going to see that this matches what we have here. And any properties that we don't need to use, like ID, we're not going to need that, or the created at or updated at properties. We don't need those, so we can just ignore them and just add the ones that we do need. But we do have to be very careful that these types do match. Like if we were, for example, to put int, this is not going to decode properly when we actually decode the JSON. So we have to make sure that these are of the right types. So now we have our model set up. So now out of the model view controller stuff, we have the model set up right here. We started working on our view, which is the storyboard right here, but we don't actually have any code in our view controller yet. So this is where we need to go next. So actually this is a good place to stop this lesson right here. Again, in this lesson, we just wanted to cover reading API documentation and getting that model layer set up inside of our application. So in the next lesson, what we're going to do is we're actually going to make an API request, and we're going to start to display some data on the screen and see what that looks like. So without further ado, I will see you in the next lesson.